Kia ora koutou katoa. Daniel Berrigan died at the age of 95 in 2016. He was the first priest in US history to be arrested for protesting against war. And he became in the 1960s a symbol of opposition to the Vietnam War, and then in the 70s and 80s to nuclear weapons. He taught that God does not bless war, justify war, or create war. He pointed to a non-violent Jesus who blesses peacemakers, calls us to love our enemies, and commands us to take up the cross of non-violent resistance. Dan not only helped end the Vietnam War and lead the movement against nuclear weapons, but changed the understanding of the Catholic Church in how it taught and thought about war. Dan Berrigan was born in 1921 and entered the Jesuits as a teenager. He spent some time in France and studied Buddhism before being ordained as a priest in 1952. He published his first poetry book in 1957 and won the Lamont Poetry Award. He would go on to publish 50 books of poems, essays, theology, journals, plays, and scriptural studies. At Dan's 80th birthday, Kurt Vonnegut said, "Dan is Jesus as a poet." By the mid-1960s, Father Daniel Berrigan had become a leading voice against the Vietnam War, which most Americans right up to the end of that war supported. On October the 22nd, 1967, there was a massive mobilization at the Pentagon, and Dan took a delegation of Cornell students to that protest. He was teaching at Cornell at the time, and they were all arrested. It was to be the first of hundreds of times of being arrested for Dan Berrigan. On May the 17th, 1968, Dan, as part of the Cantonsville 9, entered a draft board house in Cantonsville, Maryland, took 300 draft files, went out into the parking lot, and in front of the press poured homemade napalm on the draft records and burned them. I quote from his press statement that day: "My apologies, good friends, for the fracture of good order, the burning of paper instead of children, the angering of the orderlies in the front parlour of the charnel house. We could not, so help us God, do otherwise." Their action attracted massive press and led to hundreds of similar demonstrations. It helped end the war and the draft. After being sentenced for his part in the protest at Cantonsville, Daniel disappeared for 4 months, popping up at campuses all around the country. This infuriated J. Edgar Hoover and led to Dan topping the FBI's most wanted list. Probably a first for a Catholic priest too. He was rearrested in August 1970 at the home of William Stringfellow, and he served 3 years in prison. He became one of the most well-known priests in the world and consistently called for the church to abolish the just war theory and return to the non-violence of Jesus. He never, though, had a bishop who offered public support to him. I know how that feels. On September 9th, 1980, Dan, his brother Phil, also a priest, and 6 friends walked into the General Electric headquarters in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, and hammered on unarmed nuclear weapon nose cones. They are arrested, convicted, and faced up to 10 years in prison. Their plowshares, beating swords into plowshares. Their plowshares action was the first of hundreds of similar actions against the bomb. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Dan spoke each week around the United States and published books on poems and essays, studies of the Hebrew Bible. He also served as a hospital chaplain in New York hospitals for the poor. Like other non-violent practitioners for peace, I'm thinking of people like King, Tafiti, Gandhi. His public actions and deep spirituality were inseparable. Here's some of his wisdom. He wrote, "As we work for peace and justice, let go of results. Do good because it's good. Speak the truth because it's right. Work for justice and peace because that's what God wants. And leave any outcome to God." He believed in non-violence, but 3 types. Contemplative non-violence. He spent time in meditation and prayer every day. Active non-violence. Standing, marching, sitting where you're not wanted. He took action over and over again. And prophetic non-violence. Writing and speaking out publicly for justice and peace. He had a long-haul view of things. He once told his friend and fellow Jesuit John Deere, "Do not be afraid. Don't live in fear. Live in faith and hope and peace." He practiced fearlessness like Gandhi. Dan lived by the saying, if you want to be hopeful, you have to do hopeful things. He used to say, we're going to reverse Dante and say, take on hope, all ye who enter here. He also named the evil he was resisting as death with a capital D. He said what we're up against is not just war, nukes and so forth, but death itself. The culture of violence is death, he said. We see death everywhere, in our 35 wars and the 800 million sisters and brothers starving around the world, in our racism, sexism, corporate greed, executions, 16,000 nuclear weapons, and ongoing environmental destruction. But he went on to say, you and I do not promote death, serve death, or work for death. We serve life. Moreover, he insisted death does not get the last word. Life has a slight edge over death. On one Easter Sunday, he was picnicking with friends in Central Park, New York, and they were reflecting on the resurrection of Jesus. Dan said, if I were him, after all that violence that had been done to him, I wouldn't have come back. I'd be resentful and angry. But Jesus makes breakfast for these people, these followers of his who betrayed him and ran away. There's no anger or resentment or revenge in Jesus. Today I chose as the first reading the poem Some, S-O-M-E. You can look it up on the internet. It reminded me of Dan's quip, don't just do something, stand there. The reference at the end of the poem Some to bread and the risen bread is a metaphor from John's Gospel, chapter 6:35, a metaphor for Jesus being the ongoing and literal food for the hungry, life for those suffering and dying, and hope for us all. Well, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, in one form or another, appears in numerous places in Jewish and Greek wisdom and beyond. Its use in Luke's text, our second reading today from Luke 6, is distinctive. Jesus is not its author, and so its presentation as such is no major step beyond either Judaism or Greek philosophy. Jesus' near contemporary Hillel, for instance, is also reported as saying, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That is the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation." Jesus' originality, however, lies not in proposing the golden rule, but reinterpreting it as love your enemies. Where typically this do unto others principle is seen as a summary of decent behavior, Jesus pushes much harder. It's not enough to be kind to those from whom you expect kindness in return, or to whom you otherwise owe it. It is the love of enemies, not the love of friends, that marks the followers of Jesus. Recently in the news, you may recall that the US Vice President J.D. Vance attempted to use theological ethics to defend deportation of undocumented migrants. Vance tried to claim that the Christian ordo amoris, order or structure of love, means that you love your family, and then your neighbor, and then your community, and then your fellow citizens, kind of like concentric rings. For Vance, there is a priority order when it comes to who gets loved, and the clear message being that treatment of immigrants is beyond that of citizens, is less important. It's down the priority list than love of family, neighbor, community, or fellow citizens. And it's precisely this sort of prioritizing that Jesus is criticizing. The response of Pope Francis to the Vice President's ethics is worth reading. The grain of truth in Vance's ethics is that we are indeed called to act with particular care and love towards those in our daily lives, not least to those whom we are bound in family structures. But, here's the rub, also in whatever concrete situations of need we encounter. Love is certainly not just love people in principle at whatever distance. Yet this order of love that Augustine of Hippo named and Thomas Aquinas elucidated is not a theological rationale for familial or national particularism. Thomas, in fact, wrote, "One ought, for instance, to succor a stranger in extreme necessity. I'll read that again. One ought, for instance, to succor a stranger in extreme necessity, rather than one's own father, if he is not in such urgent need." And that, called triaging, is what guides our medical professionals today. There is indeed an ordo amoris, and unless rightly ordered, love is not really love as Jesus meant it. And the right ordering of love begins and ends with the love of God for all. This would apply even to the traditional renderings of the Golden Rule. We should treat migrants and refugees as we'd want to be treated ourselves. And the other great principle of Israelite religion, to love one neighbor as oneself, leads in that same direction. Yet in Jesus' sermon, that is our text today, we have something more radical and difficult than the common decency so often lacking in the public sphere. And that is the imperative to love our enemies. Not just family or needy. It's a command. love your enemies. If the true order of love defies appropriation for Vance's politics, nevertheless there's no easy escape from Jesus' call for the earnest liberal or appalled progressive either. The fact that it is presently so easy to see the lack of moral substance in some others' public actions is a spiritual danger. Jesus tells those who listen not to judge. God's mercy is not constrained by our own views of how much others may need it, nor of whether they deserve it. If we are to love our enemies, we must stand with the poorest and most marginalized. But we cannot leave the powerful mistreaters off our prayer lists either. In our own context, I wrote on Tuesday about the Christianity of Destiny Church being used to bolster their belief that not only is it okay to protest in their war on woke, it's also okay to intimidate and intimidate children and assault library staff and parents. And I, like many New Zealanders, are appalled by this. I also find the ethics of their actions at the library hard to reconcile with Christianity. So is our Lucan text, in telling us not to judge, to love and pray for those who intimidate and assault, and in effect stand on the sidelines as these warriors against woke continue to rampage? And this is where I find the thinking and practice of great spiritual resistors against injustice, like Te Whiti and Tohu of Parihaka, Mahatma Gandhi in India, and like Father Daniel Berrigan in the US. How I find them inspirational and helpful. So a few brief comments. Firstly, these great spiritual resistors were careful with their language, their framing of the struggle. Berrigan talked about resisting evil, which he named as death with a capital D. Not a war against death, for the war word and metaphor can lead people to justify all sorts of misdemeanors and atrocities on both sides. Indeed, the metaphor and reality of war divides the world into sides. Berrigan instead, by using the word death or evil, allows them to separate a person's actions from their being. Their actions might be serving death, but the person in their being is a child of God. And in theological language, death, like evil, is already defeated in Christ. And we don't have to war against it. We just have to resist it. Secondly, they taught that resisting is an action. It's something we do. As Gandhi said, action expresses priorities. It might be speaking up, writing, signing a petition, sitting or standing where you're not supposed to, sharing your views, or supporting by conversation or coin. Resisting is also something carefully done, consequences considered, collateral damage, like how it impacts innocence, considered. How does this action in resisting also maintain my belief and commitment to the dignity and worth of every person, including those who are promoting the opposite of life and goodness? Thirdly and lastly, always allow for the possibility we might be wrong. The temptation to justify our actions with theological language is always strong. The temptation to put God on our side is always strong. Not that God, the God of the Bible, the God of Judaism and Christianity, doesn't take sides. No, God always asks, how are we treating the most vulnerable, the most marginal? What hope are we offering? Charity or justice or neither? Are we offering a seat at the table or crumbs on the porch? Who sets the rules for the table? And what will you and I give up to be bearers of hope, God's hope, and God's life in this time? Blessings to you this week.